Okay, Scythe here, you're there. Let's do this again. Give it another shot. Now, it seems to me the lighting's not ideal, and I'm sorry for that. It's dark here. It's in the evening, and I wanted to knock this lecture out, and maybe the next one for Friday. I'm trying to get ahead of things. I'm just so overwhelmed with things that I need to do here in Cambridge. But what I wanted to do was just knock out the second of a four-part introduction, not to the course, but to the literature. And I know you're getting some sense of what I'm all about, and you'll even have more of a sense of what this is all about, as in this four-part introduction to the literature. I'm wanting to introduce you to the sense and sequence of the way it all unfolds. I want to remind you on the front end, we're going to pray, of course, and we'll look at the literature some more, but I want to underscore something here, and that is that when you're opening up the Old Testament, what you're doing, in effect, is you're looking into Israel's family diary. I mentioned that. Of course, the Bible is the church's book. It belongs to all people. But when you're looking at the Older Testament, you're looking at literature that wasn't written to, for, or about 21st century Christian people. Now, certainly it applies, but I subscribe to a statement that really is axiomatic, and that is that the first interpretation of any text belongs to the people to whom it is speaking. And that's true whether we're looking at what Paul is saying to the Ephesians or whether we're listening to what Moses is saying to Hebrews. What we want to do is take leave of the moment and climb back into another world. And it starts off simply enough, though my approach may be a little different than what you're used to for Garden Variety Church Bible teaching. It's the story, though I bring my own vocabulary and my own ways and means to it, in looking at the origin of the biblical drama, the Pentateuch, Moses, and all the rest. There's some familiarity with that. Now, we're going to evolve into unfamiliar territory here. And with that in mind, you might recall I told you that I had uploaded a chart, and I want you to keep this in mind. I want to speak to you about this chart, which provides something of an heuristic model to enable you to organize your thinking. And you've heard me at the outset to alight upon these foundational books, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers. I haven't done Joshua and Judges yet. I'll do that quickly. And then we go into the more complex. But what I want to just commend you on the front end, on the assumption that you have, in fact, received this. You've fished it out of your course documents. When it comes to the Old Testament, and this is particularly true, mind you, for historical purposes, and this is the section, there's different genre, there's different types of Old Testament literature, but particularly with looking at it historically, I want to give you a picture for something I've already told you. If you look at this chart and look at this horizontal axis here, you'll see there are 11 books noted. And I've already mentioned those books to you. And I've told you that if you would read these books in this order, it gives you the basic storyline of the Older Testament. Everything else comes into a period that's noted in these 11 books. These 11 foundational books give the basic structure. And I want to just commend this to you again with a visual. It starts at Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, and Judges. And you'll note there's lines here and here. It denotes, for my purposes, the periodization of Old Testament history, not genre, but different periods. And I'm imposing this grid on it, this tripartite division, because it helps make some sense of it. I call this first period the formulative era. It begins with the promise in Bereshit in Genesis, where God says, I will make of you a great nation, we see that nation coming forth in Exodus. Finally, Moses runs his course, and he passes the baton to Joshua, who leads them into the land. There's a number of years at play there where you have the conquest of the land, subsequent to which, after Joshua, as you'll see, we have this period of judges, where there's no longer a centralized leader and everyone backslides. It just becomes a very swampy world. We'll get into that today. The reason why I'm mentioning this here is you have this seminal promise in early Genesis where God says, I'll make of you a great nation and a great people. By the time you get to Joshua and Judges particularly, you have the emergence of this nation, this Hebrew nation, and they're placed in a land. They don't perform very well, but the point is the people are in a land. God promised in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, I'll make of you a great nation, a great people, etc. And we see the emergence. Now, there's something of a paradigm shift socially that's going to take place. We're going to see as we review that, Judges, well, Joshua at the first is characterized by Joshua, the centralized leader. God says to him, as I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. You're going to lead him on to good success. Cool on that. And he does. His life runs its course. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he's intransigent. He's doggedly determined. He's bold about it. And he leads them into the future. Absent him, there's no longer a centralized leader. The different tribes are to go to their tribal allotments. And they each do what's right in their own eyes. And they're, as we're going to see, constantly overrun by their enemies. It's in the aftermath of that, or better in conjunction with that, that the people beg the last of these judges, Samuel, to appoint a king. A strong, centralized leader that can galvanize these tribes. And he forges them into a federation. He militarizes them. Saul does at the first. He doesn't start off very well, and he's going to deteriorate on the quick. And we'll see in this other period, after Judges, we have this monarchical era, so-called. And that's the word I want to impose, monarchy. Starts off with Saul, not so good. Then David, a good start, but then he falters. Solomon, a good start, he falls hard. And what happens after Solomon? And we find the story of David's rise against Saul's demise in 1 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, it's all about David. And he's going to deteriorate. Solomon is going to come to power, subsequent to which then there's going to be a civil war that's noted in the books of Kings. You have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. There's going to be a civil war. You'll note here I have a line. Here's this formulative era here on this side. On this, from here to here in Old Testament history, we have the monarchy that's told during the period of Samuel and Kings, or Shmuel and Malkim in Hebrew. We have, there's this one line here, there's a united monarchy. Saul, David, Solomon, and then when we get to Solomon's son Rehoboam, you'll see there's a split. It's like a fork in the road, here and here. There's going to be a civil war. The 10 tribes are going to pull away to the north under Solomon's heir. He's going to facilitate the split because he's a worthless piece of human wreckage. And the 10 tribes are going to pull away. It's kind of like in America, the north and the south. You have the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and you have the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. Eventually, Israel is going to be destroyed in 722, 721 BCE, and Judah is going to be annexed as a Babylonian holding in 605, thereabouts, and eventually it's going to crumble in 586 BCE with the destruction of the temple. That's going to bring to a close the period of the monarchy. Now I'm imposing this, the formulative era, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, the period of the judges, the birth of the nation, getting into the land, and then you're going to have the monarchy here. and it gets complex. This is where we're going to go into the unfamiliar. I mentioned this at the outset. When you look at some writings in the Older Testament, it'll say in the days of so-and-so king of Israel and so king of Judah, such and such happened. And this notes this bifurcation, this division. We have a united monarchy and then a divided monarchy. There's in effect two kingdoms. And you can see here associated with Solomon's era, you have Saul, David, and Solomon. There are bodies of literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, attributed to Solomon, associated with him. And similarly, when we look at these historical books, we're looking at Shmuel and Malking, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written. It's a tad bit superfluous, but it expands. If you look at 1st and 2nd Kings, it's going to tell us about the kings of both the north and the south. The chronicler who writes Chronicles, however, speaks to, for, and about the issues in the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is going to come to an inglorious end with its being overrun by Babylonia. And then you have a break. You see space here, exile. Space, exile. After the exile runs its course, eventually Judeans are going to be able to come back to the ancestral homeland under Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Hebrew Bible, originally these were one book. And but I'm good to go to divide it. I'm good with the division. Speaking of divisions, let me explain some of these other things here. You already heard me to say it already, but it's good to show it and say it. And you've heard me to say in this lecture so far, in the first 10 minutes, 11 minutes, that we're going to go from the familiar to perhaps the unfamiliar because it gets more complex. You might recall on Monday I spoke to you about the suzerain treaty. God says if you're compliant, that's great. If you're not, that's not. You're going to be punished. And you see how punishment is meted out finally with the complete annihilation of the northern kingdom of Israel and the destruction of Judea. And they're being transported into Babylonia. Now, here's where history becomes an issue. And you've read a little bit about history. And if I can just give you some historical backdrop to the story that you already know and then proceed from there. I'm not holding up a map right now. I'm just simply holding up a chart. But if you look at the beginnings of the story with Abram, people say Abraham was a Jew. No, he wasn't. He was a Hebrew. He was from Ur of Chaldee, modern Kuwait. He makes his way along the Fertile Crescent. The family settles down in Syria. He goes down then into Canaan proper. But eventually he's going to be waylaid, and the whole of the tribe is going to be waylaid in North Africa, in the land of Mitzrayim, in Egypt. From Egypt, they're going to make their way back finally under Moses, and then with Joshua more fully into the land. They're going to make their way back to Eden, if you will. That is the Holy Land, the Promised Land. But it's important to understand that when you're looking at the Hebrew people, you're looking at a small group of people, all things considered. It's amazing Jews have been around that long as we have, thousands of years. The reason why I say that is if you look at Judea on a map, and you've heard me to say already, it's this patch of land that connects North Africa, Asia, and over into Europe. And these nations are running through it, overrunning it, and developing suzerainty over it. I mention that because when you speak of history, and this is where it gets complex, if you look at Abraham's leaving to go on the journey to Canaan, this is at a time when the Elamites are pressing from the east on Ur, and there's migrations. He goes over Egypt, he makes his way into Canaan, and once the tribe gets to Canaan, there are all these different people groups there that are going to be contended with. But then there'll be larger empires that overrun. I mention that because in order to understand the Old Testament, not only do ancient Near Eastern studies come into play to understand ancient Assyria, Elam, and Egyptology to speak about what's happening in North Africa. But similarly, when you're right there in Canaan proper, there are these world powers that rise and fall that factor into things that are happening in the Older Testament. For example, Assyria is going to arise. And I remember, I'm in England right now. I remember, over 30 years ago, I was here, and at the London Museum, the British Museum, I looked, they have a beautiful exhibit on Assyriology, ancient Assyria. And it's Assyria that comes and swoops down and destroys the northern kingdom. And these prophets warn about that. Listen, they say, look, you have to live up to the terms of the covenant. If you don't, you don't do it, God's not going to protect you. And he doesn't. He lets them be annihilated. Assyria is part of the biblical drama. What's going to happen with Assyria, however, is that eventually Assyria is going to be gobbled up by Babylonia. And then Babylonians going to sweep into the region, and they're going to gobble up the southern kingdom of Judah and take Judah into captivity. And then Babylonia is eventually going to be overrun by the Persians. And with the Persians, there's going to be a new state policy, and they're going to allow the Hebrews to return back to Judea if they want to and rebuild. And I said all that to say this: history plays into the drama so significantly, there's no way to really understand the Older Testament drama without understanding the historical world within which the drama plays out. I liken it to a production. You can have a play at the stage of Christ for the Nations Institute. Now you're just watching a video with some guy with a shaded face, but sorry about that. But it is what it is. I got to knock these things out when I can, and I don't have daylight coming through my windows right now. I'm relying on this light, and I know it's not good, and, I'll try and go with daylight, but I'm just so busy through the week that I just needed to knock this stuff out when I can, because I got a lot of reading to do myself. Just like I'm making you read. Well, they make me read. There's just a lot of it. But the history is so important. When you're reading the Older Testament, it's not just that you're entering into somebody else's world, the Hebrew people's world, but you're entering into a whole other world, period, and it's rather complex. And it takes a little bit of savvy, a little bit of discipline in order to come to terms with it. It's taking leave of the moment to climb into another world. And we're going to pray together, and I'll do my second of a 4-part treatment of the Older Testament, and we'll dive a little more into that world by getting into some more of the particulars associated with the biblical drama. But as I'd said, and as you've read, on the assumption that you've done the reading, and by the way, you must do the reading. I don't want excuses. I want reading. Get it done beforehand. This stuff makes more sense if you've done prior reading. If you haven't done reading, there's no way to really derive any benefit from it. But it's this complex world, and it's going to become more complex as we make our journey through the day. In this lecture, 25 more minutes or so. Well, we're going to pray together. I'll lead you in prayer, and then we'll go at it, okay? Good deal. Lord, we come before you and bless your name, and thank you for these good people minded to offer me an opportunity to give a telling of the Old Testament drama, Father. I pray that you help them to glean what needs to be gleaned. And if it's all too confusing right now, Lord, just for them to experience it and develop an appreciation for the complications associated with it, I'm happy with that. But I pray you enlighten their minds and hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Well, we left off with the, and I'm flipping through, I have a little notebook here that I used to make students buy that I put together. You've heard me to walk through the Pentateuch and tell you when the different books were written and the story behind it. After Moses, of course, we come to Joshua. And by the way, if you're interested in Joshua and the conquest, and I'm a military kind of guy, you have to be a little bit if you're going to be a police officer, and, I have an assault rifle I take out on patrol, and I have a Glock, and, it's, I try and be nice to people, and I want to do it, but if they want to take it if they want to go another way with it, well, we'll go hands-on or worse. I've never shot anybody, but 97% of police never fire a gun except for on the range. And I hope to never have to. Of course, I'm much less on the streets, but I have that kind of bravado, that little military side of me. It's worth underscoring, if you look at these biblical people, they're soldiers. That's another way that they can be unlike us. You wouldn't think of that for religious purposes. You go, wait a minute, that can't be. Moses said, thou shalt not kill. No, he didn't. Ten Commandments doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. Murder speaks of a brazen, wanton disregard for life and killing. That's murder. But these men were soldiers and were vested with the responsibility to go to war. And some people do that. It's a different kind of world. It's a different orientation. Moses was something of a military leader in a sense. I mean, he's a priestly, kingly kind of fellow at one level, but he's beckoning people onward into the battle. He runs his course, and at 120 years of age, and he passes the baton to somebody else, Joshua. And if you're interested in the conquest per se, you could Google my name, Jeffrey Seif, and I did a television series. I work on television. This is coming to you on Wednesday morning. Wednesday nights, Daystar, I appear after dinner, and on Friday nights, and on Thursday nights on Trinity Broadcasting Network. But I did a series. If you Google my name, Jeffrey Seif, Joshua, More Than a Conqueror. Actually, it was a series that I did and aired a year ago, an 8-part series. I actually go to the places where these battles were fought, and we have dramatic reenactments that offer a telling of them to reconstruct them. And then I look to extract certain spiritual principles from all that can be applicable for today, which, by the way, I'm less inclined to do here. Most preachers open up a Bible. How does it relate to people today? And, being an Old Testament survey professor, at one level I could care less, because this is more about helping you understand yesterday than it is to make the application to today. How the Bible applies today is the most important thing as a rule of thumb, but it's unimportant for my purposes here. The Old Testament survey just gets you back to the biblical world to reconstruct it. How you apply it and bring it forward is another story. So I'm less inclined to do that. Here with Joshua, and Joshua is the 4th foundational book. The key chapter there is chapter 6, verse 27. Victory is the key word, where, if you follow the Lord, difficulties notwithstanding, he'll lead you on into victory. And that's what we see at play with Joshua. But we're going against different people groups, these tribal kingdoms that are nestled in Canaan, different people groups. Canaanite is a rather broad term. There's different ites, Moabites, Ammonites, Amorites, there's Philistines on the eastern coastal plain, there's Jebusites that are there in the capital city, there's different ites, there's different people that have a toehold. Joshua leads military campaigns against that in order to knock out the main power bases of resistance. And with that attended to, then he dispatches the tribes to go back to their allotments. He takes a humble allotment for his own family, and he dispatches them to go their way. I liken the battles in Joshua to a military campaign where you send in the special forces, the Delta guys. My wife, for a Christmas present, she brought me special lessons with a Delta Force soldier about using an assault rifle. That's a strange, birthday present, but she knows she has this kind of guy, and she got it for me. Well, you have these special forces types that go in and knock out the main power bases of Canaanite resistance. With that attended to, the army in effect disbands. The tribes go to their respective areas, and then those tribes are to go in there and do mop-up operations in the period of the Judges. But in any case, in Joshua, you have the key word is victory. You have centralized leadership. He's in charge. And there's nothing like being involved in a web of relationship where there's someone who is proactive. It's like there's a verse in the Corinthian correspondence, where Paul says, wives, how do you know if you won't save your husbands? The question there, if you have a believing spouse and an unbelieving spouse, if there's someone with that resolution, with that determination, that has an effect in the family system. I mentioned this parenthetically. I remember I went and did a continuing ed stint at Harvard University, and Barry, my wife, was, well, why do you do that? You really don't need that. But then I did it. She was gracious. Let me do what I do. I earn the money. I can spend it. And I went and did it. And funny, last week she finished her continuing ed thing at Harvard University because she's involved in a family where, someone that's close to her has that kind of energy, focus on education. Others kind of get drawn into that. And it's like that, not with someone who's yelling and screaming like a fanatic, but someone who internally has a certain kind of religious disposition. It has the net effect of inculcating that into others. Similarly, if you have an executive coalition, a family, and a husband and a wife, we set the pace and we do it, and it has a way of getting into the next generation eventually. I'll just mention this parenthetically, that I saw a study in Europe, about, I'm sure there's issues associated with children growing up and they're raised in a Christian home and then they become teenagers and they take leave of it all. They go off to college somewhere, not CF&I, but they go off to college and they just forget all about their Sunday school lessons. I put it like this: you can have a young man, I can spend 18 years to raise a guy, he meets the wrong girl, that'll all get undone in about 18 seconds. I know guys are stupid. And there go the Sunday school lessons. But I saw an interesting study. If it's the male in the family, the husband and the wife, unfortunately, we live in a world today, it's arguably the woman who's the more doggedly determined in too many cases. But if the man has that biblical resolution, that has a more positive effect even for the children in the future. It's not to say when they hit adolescence, they won't get a little wobbly, but there is this returning. There's nothing like a man in a family system who, like Joshua, is going to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now here I'm getting kind of preachy, and I said I wouldn't do it. Well, what I want you to know about Joshua records it's about 5 to 7 years of the actual conquest of Canaan. It's how long it takes. And the purpose of the book is to record the land's conquest and demonstrate God's faithfulness to his word. Against all odds, that he does it. Joshua dies, and as I've mentioned on too many occasions already, that things go bad afterward. You no longer have that resolve, that centralized personality. And if you would read Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 19, you'll read it. In fact, open your Bibles now to it. You'll see where the author gives voice to the fact that, everyone turned away and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They forsook the law of Moses. And as a result of it, they lost that protection. And the net result is they were overrun by their enemies. You see this interesting thing at play in Joshua and Judges. Joshua serves the Lord, and the Lord gives him good success as a result of it. And when you see failure, it's because of disobedience. But what's clear theologically, when you look at the literature, is that if you serve the Lord, you're going to have success at the end of the day. By way of contradistinction in Judges, they lose interest. They get bored. They do something else. They cast the law behind their backs, and they get overrun by these various peoples, and they're afflicted. And they cry out, "Oh God, help, help, help." And God does. He raises up a deliverer, a judge, which is why it's called Judges. And these judges, by the way, at various levels, are not particularly impressive. He uses interesting characters, and we'll get to that when I take an x-ray of the book of Judges more deliberately. All this is just by way of introduction. What happens, these various ites, these various regional peoples overrun, and he raises up judges, and they're able to be delivered. But then when the judge dies, they all go back to their wicked ways, and they get overrun again, over and over and over again, 332 some odd years. It's a mess. Finally, the last of the judges, Samuel, his sons are worthless pieces of human wreckage. And one of the reasons why they want a king, and I mentioned this earlier, the people, they want a king. And that's the key word, by the way, for 1 Samuel, king. You'll see in chapter 8, verse 5, they call out for a king. One of the reasons why they did it was because they thought, well, maybe if we could be galvanized into a federation, united we stand, divided we fall. We'll have more manpower to throw against these enemies that are coming at us. It used to be someone's attacking the tribe of so-and-so, a tribe 100 miles away says, that's their problem, that's not mine. But when you have a king, you can bring force of arms together from all the different tribes. If you can imagine, there would never have been an American Revolution if there were just 13 colonies, because no one of those colonies could handle the British. I don't want to speak too loud. My window's open, and here I am in England, but we won. But it wouldn't have happened. King George is way too strong. But by virtue of the tribes uniting, then you have different soldiers coming from different tribes that can begin to throw themselves against the troubles of the day. And the people were hoping for that. But another reason why they wanted a king is Samuel's kids were so pathetic, they didn't want their boys to be ruling over them. They didn't want their leadership. In any case, when you get to 1 Samuel, they call out for a king, and you see Saul initially, prima facie, face value, he looks like he's made of the right stuff, has a very command presence, he's tall, and it's interesting, by the way, people equate height with leadership. So when you have these presidential debates, when they're at the podium, their torso in relationship to the dais looks equivalent. If one looks shorter than the other, it telegraphs subtly weakness. At least that's the way people perceive it. Now, Napoleon wasn't very tall, so there's exceptions to the rule. But the point is, if you look at the literature, Saul is represented as being very stately, and he looks like he's made of the right stuff, but he has the wrong kind of interior. He's too into being the king. Sometimes people with power, they don't carry it well. They get too into having power. It's like that. There's this natural. I was such a screw up and a loser in life, and I remember when I was ordained and I was Reverend Jeffrey Seff, I couldn't wait to get it on my business card because it telegraphed, a title that in my mind gave me a little social power. And then when I got a doctorate, Dr. Seif, you can't help but get into it a little, but then you got to back away from that. The more mature realize that doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. You know what it's like, too, if you've ever dealt with a police officer, he's relatively new or she's relatively new and, kind of too into having that power. We live in a world today where people are going to be socially empowered, but you don't want to get into it too much. At the end of the day, you want to realize you're like everybody else. That's why it's good for me to tell you, listen, I'm a student like you. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Seif. The reason why I'm doing the talking and you're doing the listening is because I've sat where you're sitting longer than you've sat. You've been there for a couple of days, let's say. Well, my educational career went from 27, for many years. I finished my last degree really 10 years ago. So you figure it's decades, it's years, hours and hours and hours. And if I'm making you read a book, well, people made me read. And if I'm asking you to listen to me, well, hey, other people have asked me to listen to them. And, I'm doing this not because I'm better than you, but because I've been doing this longer than you. And I like to think of myself as a fellow student. Now, if you get in my face and want to be adversarial, well, then I'll remind you I'm a doctor. I'll use power if I need to, but it's not the preferred mode. I mention that, not that this is a class about me, but Saul was too into it. It was his nemesis, his own undoing. The seeds of our own demise are resident within all of us as human beings. And you can see Saul deteriorating on the quick. Now, David had a different kind of disposition, a man after God's own heart. You can see it with his song, with his worship, with his overall spirit. There's a kind of humility there. But David, he's going to blow it too, but not in 1 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, by the time we're into 2 Samuel, David has come into his own. And by the way, I should say, you can read in 1 Samuel where, the prophet goes to, Jesse, David's family house, and God's told me we've got a kid here to make king, and Saul, and Jesse brings out the first son, the next, and the next, and the next. And the prophet says, no, 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 and you got to have someone here. And his father says, well, there's Davy over there in the barn, but he certainly couldn't be. David is brought forth. He's the man. He's anointed. Isn't it beautiful? Yeah, it is. But David's going to spend the next 13 years of his life running from Saul. Just because you're anointed doesn't mean everything's going to flower immediately. And you see the trials of David. And now you can read through 1 Samuel, in a reasonably, depending on how fast you read, you can read it quick. But really, it's a 13-year period from the time that he's anointed to be king to when he's appointed to be king. You know, it's like you go to a revival service on a Sunday night and lays hands on you, and God's called you to destiny, to the nations, and you're so excited. You still have to wake up Monday morning and go back to working at McDonald's. Hey, Jones, you're late. Get over here. And, well, you don't understand. I'm an anointed man of God. Well, wonderful anointed man of God. Go flip those hamburgers. You're working at McDonald's, Your Highness. Or Burger King. You might think you're the king, but here you're flipping burgers for us now, champ. Get to work. You know, just because you have an anointing on you doesn't mean it all manifests immediately. That certainly wasn't the case with David. He had years of hardship that he had to go through. Same thing with Paul, by the way. God anointed Paul, knocked him off his horse, you know, gave him the vision and the call to go. But it's going to take 13 years till he actually is appointed in Antioch, where hands are laid on him, and he is dispatched to go with Barnabas on his first missionary journey. It doesn't always happen on the quick. In any case, you see David, he's made of the right stuff, but he's going to unravel, unfortunately, because he's going to get too comfortable being the king. He's going to send others out to battle, and he's going to be sitting at his house getting a little lazy, and he sees this woman, and he goes, no, that's what I'm talking about. Now, David had too many women on the whole. Kings did that at the time, and I might talk about that at another time. But then what it is he went after a woman, Bathsheba, and that was his undoing. Now, God forgave him for his sins, but his sons didn't. And his problems were compounded by the fact that after he married Bathsheba, and the child who was born of adultery died, but he had another child through her named Solomon. And Solomon was favored in the family dynamic, and he had other boys, David did, who had come to the family more legitimately. And in a primogenitive system where the older boys get the dynasty, that this Solomon was favored was problematic because he was younger and because he came through Bathsheba. They didn't all like that intrusion. And though God forgave David for his sins, he's going to spend, after his bad moment in 2 Samuel, he's going to spend his time running from his own sons. It's rather tragic. But David really is a central character in 2 Samuel. By the time you get to Kings, and here's where it's going to start to get complex. Solomon's son Rehoboam is going to come to power, and you've already heard me to say ad nausea where there's a civil war, and it breaks up into different, in two kingdoms in effect. The kingdom to the north is referred to as Ephraim, Samaria, and Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. The key word for 1 Kings is the word division. There's a civil war. It's broken apart. And finally, in 2 Kings, when you look at 1 and 2 Kings, you see the succession of kings. And there's these little sound bites about this king, and then this one followed in the northern kingdom, in the southern kingdom. But it really gives voice to the fact that it all came to an inglorious end. Subsequent to which then, by the time you get to Ezra, the northern kingdom had been decimated for many, many years, and the southern kingdom was overrun and displaced into Babylonia and then Persia subsequent, as the Persians overran Babylonia. And then there's a new state policy, and individuals are beckoned who would like to return to the ancestral homeland. The key word for Ezra, the key words I'd say spiritual restoration, therein, with the new Persian monarch giving permission for displaced persons to return to their ancestral lands, some Judeans go back, and in chapter 6, they begin to rebuild the place. You have temple reconstruction, and you have reformations that are enacted in chapter 9. Now, so they're religiously getting it back together, but what happens is when you look at Nehemiah is back in the Persian court, and some emissaries from Judea return some years later, and he inquires of how things are going back in Judea, and they tell him, listen, you know, the place is in a state of disrepair. Politically, the walls haven't been reconstructed, and it just isn't taken care of. Subsequent to which the king notices that Nehemiah has a dire look on his face. What's wrong with you? And he begs permission to go back to his ancestral land. And in Nehemiah chapter 6, he's going to rebuild the walls. Nehemiah comes back as a governor, if you will. In fact, if you look at this post-exilic era, post is the Latin prefix for after, as opposed to pre, which harks to before. If you look at the post-exilic era, Zerubbabel is the first governor who leads them back. Ezra is this priest, this scribal character, a religious leader, who's there with them enacting reforms, but it's not put together structurally and politically. Nehemiah is going to come as the governor and take care of all of that. You know, and it's like that in a family system, by the way. You take a place like Christ for the Nations Institute. You've heard of Gordon Lindsay, the founder. If it was just him, there wouldn't be a school right now. Gordon was spacey. Gordon, you know, he wrote 250 books, way ahead of his time, brilliant, spiritual, and all the rest. But the real genius behind him and Christ for the Nations Institute was his wife, Frida Lindsay. Now, she was an administrator. No nonsense. Now, I knew Frida, and I could say I've known her well. You know, being old like me I try and pretend like I'm not. You know, I got 10 miles in this morning. Running, and, then when I get back to my room, I do push-ups all the time because I can't get to the gym right now. But, I try and act like a kid or a younger man, but I'm not. But one of the benefits of being old is you have history. And one of the benefits of being at Christ for the Nations over 30 years is I knew people. It's unfortunate today. Most people don't keep a job very long. Most people don't keep a partner very long. And I was married to my first wife before the Lord took her home for 30 years. And people went, wow, you were married 30 years, like that's something great. Barf, that's stupid. The only reason why that looks good is because we live in a culture where it's so bad. You know, people marry for an ideal. They think they got a raw deal. They'll go searching for a new deal. I like sticking to stuff. And I've been around CF&I, and I'll tell you, Frida Lindsay, no nonsense. She was an administrator, took care of business. It's like that in my family system. I'm kind of a wild and crazy kind of guy. I have a number of jobs. I earn the money. My wife's the real genius. My first wife, Patty, she took care of all the business. And Barry, my wife now, she has a PhD in biblical studies too, but she also has a master's degree in business administration. And hey, what do you think, honey? Can we do this? I mean, I don't mind sharing the power. You know, she's really the administrator behind our household affairs. You need to have one and the other. And if you look at the post-exilic era, Ezra was that spiritual leader. We're going to look into him more, and we're going to look in all these books more. Nehemiah was the administrative head. Now let's go back to this chart as I finish up today. Let me just take you back to where we began. You've heard me to say, if you look at the Older Testament historically, there are 11 foundational books here on this horizontal axis. And if these books are read in this order, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, it takes you through the whole of the Old Testament historically. If you look at the end of the Old Testament, as the Old Testament comes to a close, Judea is annexed as a Persian holding. What's going to happen is Persia is going to be overrun by the Greeks, Alexander the Great. And then, Alexander's empire is going to be divided amongst generals. And eventually, the Romans are going to take over what's left of all that. And hence you get to the New Testament era where Judea is annexed as a Roman holding. Here in the post-exilic era, it's a Persian holding. Here, it's a Babylonian holding. Here, initially, it's relatively autonomous. There's a lot of history in it. And so you've heard me to say that you really can't fully grasp the Older Testament historically. People say, well, here's what, I read the Old Testament, here's what it says spiritually. Don't tell me spiritually before you can tell me materially. Show me that you've developed an acquaintance with the literature. Once you understand the basic storyline, what's going on, then you can understand the other books. Now, we'll get to this in our next, later on down the road when we look at prophetic literature. We'll look at sapientia literature here, wisdom literature. It's a different type. Wisdom literature doesn't demand understanding history. And we'll look at the wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. It's just, insights for living from an Old Testament perspective. But by the time we look at the prophets, it's important to understand what's happening in these moments to understand what the prophets are saying. There's two northern prophets, Amos and Hosea. There's 6 southern kingdom prophets. There's 3 foreign prophets. There's 2 prophets in the exile, Ezekiel and Daniel, and there were 3 post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. There's no way to understand these prophetic words without understanding the world within which they ministered. And that means paying attention to what's happening in the biblical drama as well as what's happening in the larger world. Welcome to my world. There's much more to say, but we'll do it on another day. Till then, God bless. Ciao. Talk to you later.